We're up to our seventh part of the what and the why of prayer. We're taking a little bit of time to focus on the next stage of our davening, which is the Korbanos, the sacrifices which you say in the morning. This, to our chagrin, is one of the most overlooked, underestimated, and misunderstood parts of davening. It is the part of davening which most frequently people ask me if it's all right to miss. And that's the people who ask. So we have to appreciate what's going on, what are we doing, why are we doing it, and how it works. So what happens is that usually speaking, we look at it and we say, that's a lot of pages. Right? There really are a lot of pages there. So what do we do about all these pages? They seem to all be going at a different length. Thank you. Let me just research. Can you give me a tissue box? That's right. So I'm just doing a little higher here. Here we go. Thank you so much. No, there we go. Just need that. There you go. Okay, the folks on this side can have a little bit more height. There you go. Okay, much better. So it turns out there actually are very different parts of this whole process, and it helps us to understand the different parts and then understand the triage of the different parts, and also therefore what to do, what's most important. So let's start at the very beginning. First of all, just a basic questions, the what's. So when is the best time to say the Korbanos? So it is best to say the Korbanos when one is in shul. Why would you think that's the reason? Why is that necessary? Right, so if we're commemorating something which happened in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, then our Mikdash Ma'at, our small sanctuary, is the shul. So the most appropriate place to do them is the shul, which is why we take preference in doing them in shul if possible. What happens if I come late to shul? So if I come late to shul, the answer is you shouldn't come late to shul. But but in the unlikely circumstance, like when the captain gets on the line, he says, in the unlikely event of a loss of cabin pressure, so in the unlikely event of being late, then what does one do? So here's what happens. If the concern is that one may miss davening Kriyas Shema with the tzibur, or the Amida B'tila B'tzibur, in such an instance one can omit the Korbanos, but they still should be said. So it's not a free pass. There is a debate, as we will see, about Pesukei de Zimra, whether or not one can catch up Pesukei de Zimra afterwards, after davening. But there is no debate about Korbanos. One can certainly say the Korbanos after davening. So what would happen? So one should not sacrifice Tefillah B'tzibur for it, but one can, so to speak, reshift the program to be able to do it. So it's not necessarily the first thing that has to be said as well. From when can I say that? I wake up early in the morning, and it's the winter time, and they've just changed the law, and so now what am I going to do about the Korbanos? So actually, we're going to see, we'll do it in more detail, but it depends which of the Korbanos. So for instance, the Trumas Hadeshin and the Kiyar paragraphs can be said even at night time, whereas the Korban Tamid and the Ketoris can only be said in the daytime. We'll see in a moment just which they are and why they appear in that way. What posture should they be said in? And the answer for this is standing. This is akin to avoda, to service in the temple. There were no chairs for the Kohanim when they were doing avoda. This is how they're doing it. In fact, there are opinions in halacha that specifically those who are of priestly blood should be standing when reciting the Korban, specifically because they are the facilitators of the avoda, so they should be standing. Dr. Bilim, that's where we're at. And now, if there is or is that the Shulchan Aruch says it is a good idea to be standing, but certainly there's an opinion that definitely the Kohanim should be. So what is the triage? So there's not so many people who talk about this, but in the Tilak Hilchos, one of the footnotes, he quotes Chuvas, one of the Achronim, who says that if one is pressed, here is the, so to speak, the triage of the Korbanos. The first is Levichach Anachnu Chayavim, which is that's the paragraph which follows La'olam Yihei Adam, Yirei Shamayim V'Seis V'Galo. That whole section, Levichach Anachnu Chayavim, is really the beginning of this whole process. That should be said first. That's the most important thing to be said. The next part is the Yiratzon Shetarachem. This is the that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you should have mercy on us through the process of the Korbanos. Then the time of the Ketoris and the Lacheni Yiratzon afterwards as well. So those are the most important of this process. Let's take a look inside and sort of see what this is. If you have a siddur in front of you, it actually may be helpful. But I did try to put the general flow of what it is at the beginning of our notes, just to take a look. Yes, Tibi.
The Akedah, does that fit into?
Good question. So the Shulchan Aruch does talk about the Akedah. We're not going to focus on it so much. It's not really the Korbanos, but it is mentioned in the same area at least once. Okay, so we'll take a look at that. Maybe we'll have another time. We'll get a chance to look at the Akedah itself. So let's start at the very beginning. Why are we doing this? Why do we do Korbanos on a daily basis? So this is based on a pasuk in Hosea, and the pasuk in Hosea says, "Unashalma farim sefasenu," which essentially is the word. It gives forth the idiom, which is unfortunately misused today, which is called lip service, right? Unashalma farim sefasenu. Let our lips pay the farim, the bulls, the bullocks. So we are, by learning it, we are essentially, in a certain sense, getting there, which is why the Gemara tells us in the first source, in Menachos Kuf Yud Amud Aleph, Amar Yitzchak Mai Dichsiv V'zois Toras Hachatos V'zois Toras Ha'asham. Why is it that in describing at the beginning of Parashas Tzav, which we passed by recently, that it describes the laws pertaining to it as the Torah? Torah also means teaching. So why is that? To tell us, Kol ha'osek b'Torah chatas, ki'ilu hikriv chatas, Kol ha'osek b'Torah asham, ki'ilu hikriv asham. To tell us that it's not simply a avoda as a physical act, but it is also an avoda as a, so to speak, a spiritual learning program. So today we don't have the wherewithal to bring the Korbanos, but we do have the ability to be able to study them as well. The Chavetz Chaim was very much akin to this, and in fact, we know the most famous books that the Chavetz Chaim wrote. So what are the most famous, so to speak, contributions we know that the Chavetz Chaim made to our learning? What was that? So we know Mishnah Berurah. We also know Chavetz Chaim. That's why it's called the Chavetz Chaim. Shmiras HaLashon. But there's Avas Chesed. There's many other Svarim. But what most people are not aware of is that the Chavetz Chaim also wrote a pirush on the Gemara in Zvachim and Menachos. And that was because the Chavetz Chaim was of a firm belief as being of the priestly nature. Here the Chavetz Chaim Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen of Radin was very much akin to the idea that priests, certainly the Kohanim, should be learning the halachas of Korbanos, because B'meher of Yameinu will have a Beis HaMikdash and everybody will be clueless. So he was very much into that, and in fact there are a number of Kohanim today which are only learning Kodshim, which are learning the halachas of Kodshim. In fact, we just welcomed to our shul Rabbi Wolf, who is the Rosh Kollel of the Kollel of Kodshim on Har HaZeisim just a few weeks ago, where there's a Kollel, very small Kollel on Har HaZeisim, in the area called Ma'alei HaZeisim, with a beautiful area in there, and they're learning Kodshim. And there's the yeshiva in the old city in the Muslim quarter called Ateret Kohanim is supposed to be on this. It's not only Kohanim, but it was meant to be founded on this as well. Good question. Good question. Certain areas, depends on how you make it. The Jordanians cleared some of it for us. Be it as it may.
Josh Wander once took a Kohen friendly tour. He told me there's 13 Kohanim families living on Arizona.
There you go. So, unfortunately, there are ways to get through it, and the Jordanians helped with that a little bit between 1948 and 1967. But be as it may, that is the goal of what we're trying to do. So we're trying to recreate something which happens on a daily basis. So what is chosen? So there's a lot of Korbanos. So which ones do we say? So there are a number of different practices, and we'll see that our practice is not necessarily the one which was originally discussed. So as an example, the Shulchan Aruch tells us this is actually the beginning of Shulchan Aruch. So Orach Chaim is the first of 4 parts of the Shulchan Aruch, and the first siman of Orach Chaim is what we're talking about here. So it's Aleph, Hey. This is where Korbanos are talked about. And he says, Tov Lomar HaAkedah. So to your point, it's a good idea to say the Akedah. That's the parish of the Akedah, which is Bereshis Perek Chav Beis, which is where we inserted earlier on before La'olam Yehei Adam. V'aseres HaDibros U'Parshas Ola U'Mincha U'Shlam V'Chatas V'Asham. It is good to say all these parashios. Where are those found, by the way? Where are we referring to? The beginning of Parshas Tzav. Okay, so it actually is talked about in Parshas Vayikra and repeated in Parshas Tzav. The Malbim understands that in Parshas Vayikra it was to the Hamon Am, to the people. In Tzav it was the memo to the Kohanim, with more specifics about the Avodah. So generally speaking, it is understood to be the beginning of Parshas Tzav, which we should say the Korbanos and how they are brought. Notice, by the way, that the Ramah is going to say that it's not so clear that a person should be saying the Aseres HaDibros. That's because we don't want to overemphasize one aspect of the Torah being our only axiom of belief, because many of the tzedakим or those who might refocus and misunderstand the appropriateness of this. Then the Shulchan Aruch goes on to say, in skipping 4 seifim to Sif Tes, which is in source 3, Yesh Noagim Lomar Parshas Hakiyar. We say the section of the wash basin. V'achar Parshas Trumas Hadeshen, and that is the clearing of the ashes. V'achar Parshas Tamid, and afterwards the section of the Korban Tamid. V'achar Parshas Mizbeach Miktar Ketores, the one about the altar, the golden altar of the incense. U'Parshas Samamanei Ketores Asiyasai, and making the Ketores the incense. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Now, interestingly enough, which of these do we do and which of these do we not do? Just in terms of actually looking at these two seifim of the framework of Korbanos as discussed in the Shulchan Aruch. So which are actually in our siddur?
There are those that don't have the key
Okay, so there are different opinions about this, but let's go through this for a second. In a Sif Hay, which is our second source here, he describes saying the Akedah. So we're not going to get to the Akedah today because it's not actually a korban, it's its own commemoration of Zichus Avos. Okay, but then we talk about and we're going to leave out the Man and the Aseret Dibros because that's really an after davening discussion, because that's where they really are found in the Siddur. But he describes the Parshas Olah, Mincha, Shlamim, Chatas, and Asham. Do we say that? The answer is no, we don't say that. Our davening does not have those sections in it. We don't say that. We may say the Olah, but we'll see in a second how. Okay, we do not say the Chatas and the Asham and so on. It is interesting, there are those, the Mishabura quotes those, who, if a person were to have sinned in a way that would warrant a Chatas, they should specifically say the Korban Chatas. As if they were bringing it. So what would be an example of a person, unfortunately, who might warrant a Korban Chatas? You wake up on Shabbos morning, you flick on the lights, God forbid. Right? So that's a Chatas, your person, a lapse. That would be a Korban Chatas.
But don't we do that in Ezekiel McCommon and say that we'll say?
We'll get a second. But we don't actually say the psukim that correlate to these korbanos themselves, but we do what's in the ninth seif. So let's take a look at this. If you have your siddur, which is very helpful. Again, we don't have to, but I'm using the Yitzchak Yair, the all Hebrew siddur. Yeah. So on page 14, the first section we have is the kiyar. That's the wash basin. The second section they have headings to them is the Trumas Hadeshen. The next section is the Korban Tamid. And the next section is the Ketores. Okay, so those are precisely following what the Shulchan Aruch described here in Seif Tes. That's what we do have. We do not have those korbanos as described at the beginning of Parshas Tzav. And in fact, the Aruch HaShulchan comments on this, and he says the reason for this is because, as Shalom was hinting to, we're going to later on say, if you flip the page to one full more page, there's a parak of Mishnayos we're going to talk about, which is called Eizehu Makom Shel Zvachim. And we're going to talk about where all the sacrifices are brought. And by saying that is sufficient about talking about where all the korbanos are without having to quote the entire section. That's how the Aruch HaShulchan explains that omission. He also says, don't worry, we are not contradicting what the Shulchan Aruch had actually said, because the Shulchan Aruch says is Tov Lamar and Yesh Noagim. So the Shulchan Aruch is not saying categorically we have to say it. He's saying there are customs, so our custom has evolved to be the custom which we have, which is we say Kiyar, Trumas Hadeshen, Tamid, and Ketores, and then we have, we'll see a few one or two things in between, followed by the Ezim Makom. Yes?
So when you mention, when the Shulchan Aruch says Yesh Noagim, it sounds like it's a minority, meaning there are those that
Yep.
that meaning like the majority would not say the kiyur.
Yes.
Is that correct? I know that we don't say the kiyur.
It's a good question.
And I know other congregations that don't say the kiyur.
It's a good question. I mean, it seems to be that the most common practice is these four elements should be said. That's what it sounds like. There may be differences in communities. There may be a difference in triage. As we saw that the kiyur is not as important as the actual korban itself. We'll see why it's there in a moment, and just to appreciate this. Nusachari doesn't have the kiyur, so there are a number of nuschos which don't have it. It isn't actually a korban itself. We'll see in a second, just like to appreciate why it's there. But these four are the ones which seem to be focused on, and the other korbanos seem to be incorporated into the Mishnayos, which are the korbanos brought on a daily basis. Now, there seems to be a lot of ideas which parallel the way it was done in the Beis Hamikdash. So one of the ideas is that it is done standing up. Another idea is that it's also done, as the Shulchan Aruch says, specifically during the day. It should be that these korbanos are said during the day. Why? Because you're not allowed to bring a korban at night. There was something that happened at night. What was that? That's called Haktoras Emurim. That means to say the korban tamid, you take the limbs and the innards of the korban, and it would burn on the mizbeach all night, and therefore today our vestigial hangover is Mariv, right, which parallels that. But the actual korbanos, there was no korban brought at night. So therefore that's why we attempt to do it only during the day. The Aruch HaShulchan notes, actually, the Mishnah Berurah notes on this as well. In source 6, he says, on the top of page 4, he says, De'ein Korbanos krevim ela v'yom, aval parshas kior parshas Trumas Hadeshen yochal lomar kodem hayom. You may say the first two sections of the Korbanos before daybreak. V'im'ein lo pna yochal lomar gam parshas HaKorbanos balala. And push comes to shove, it can be done at night as well. The other ones, because it isn't actually bringing the Korbanos, it's talking about the Korbanos. But it really, preferentially, one should not say the Korbanos themselves. So now, why is this?
After Nates or?
I imagine it refers to Nates. I'll tell you why. Actually, no. It might be Olas Hashar. I'll tell you why. If anybody's learned Maseches Tamid, we did this a few years ago on the night of Shavuos. We went through the whole Masechta together. So if you remember this, it's actually Tamid is really essentially the organizing of the day in the Beis Hamikdash, what the day would look like. So if you remember, the first thing that happens is, besides the night watch and the checking for the kalim and they're going around doing the perimeter checks and all the other things that are at the beginning, then what happens is that there's a guard who's waiting on the tower, and when he sees that there's light, that he sees light on the eastern starboard, that's when he calls out Barakai. Right? He says that light has arrived, and upon that, that's when the whole action starts going. And remember, it's pretty dark at this point in time, but the action starts going, and then the specific Kohanim go out. And what's the first thing that the Kohanim do? The first thing they do is they have to wash their hands. Right? You have to wash your hands. And then the next thing they do is they do what's called Trumas Hadeshen. What is Trumas Hadeshen? Is they clean out the ashes. Why the ashes? Because all night long they were burning the emurim of the korban, the limbs of the korban tamid of yesterday. After that, then the first thing before any other korban is brought is the korban tamid, and then there's the ketoris. Now, it happens that the menorah is in that mix, and the ketoris is so to speak, in the middle of this, all of this as well. But essentially, what we're doing in the morning is we are paralleling that process. We're paralleling what a day in the Beis Hamikdash would look like: hands, ashes, korban tamid, incense. Right, so we have organic life, inorganic life being sacrificed on the outside mizbech, the inside mizbech, with the two necessary preparation steps. The reason why the first two steps can be said even at night, is because that's when they started being said. Right, if you understand. So the Trumas Hadeshen started when it was pitch black. They just saw the light sort of starting to emerge on the eastern side. No, that's why it was done as such. So we're following suit as to what would be done on a daily basis, hopefully within the hope that, first of all, our prayers or our statements are paralleling it, but also for us to have an appreciation of what the Beis Hamikdash used to look like. Now, the question is so if we want to sort of hone in, so is it really a memorial? Is it just memorializing what was so that we don't forget? Or is there more to it? And the truth is, it seems that there is a little more to it, because you will notice, and the Shulchan Aruch says this, and we can find this in our Siddurim, that there are addendums to this. So take a look at source 7. The Shulchan Aruch says, Kashe Yisayim Parshas Ha'olah, when you finish the parsha of the Olah, the burnt offering, Yomar Yiratzon She'ezeh Chashuv U'Mekubal Ki'ilu Hikravti Olah. It should be as if I sacrificed this as a burnt offering. V'kach Yomar Achar Parshas Mincha V'Ashlamim Mipnei She'em Bo'im B'Nedava, because they can be brought voluntarily. So if you'll look in the Siddurim, you'll notice after the main paragraphs, not after the Kiyar, and not after the Trumas Hadeshen, because those are not Korbanos in and of themselves fully. But before and after the Korban Tamid, there is a little Yehi Ratzon. And this is, in a certain sense, as if, says the Shulchan Aruch, it sounds like a supplication, not just a memorialization. That we're trying to say, please Hashem, let it be like that we do this. Which is why the posture of standing, which is why the daytime, for those that Korban. Here's an interesting thing, just something to be aware of, is that when you were to bring a Korban in the Beis Hamikdash, there was a great amount of emphasis on thought. It's a great emphasis on if a Kohen was bringing a Korban and had the wrong thought about some of the steps of the Korban, or the timing, or the placement of the Korban would be invalidated. So it's particularly important for us, specifically when doing the Korban Tamid, to have the focus on what the words we're doing, which is very hard because we're usually rushing, we're usually late, and the Baal Tefillah is not usually sympathetic to the state of affairs. So it is important to appreciate this as well. Rav Kook tried to capture this moment in the morning, and he does so poetically. This is a translation. Try to imagine learning this in Hebrew as you read the words. This is in Orot. This is we'll call real Rav Kook learning. There are some more accessible aspects of Rav Kook's writings, where like we learn on Shabbos together, the Eid HaYabbat, the Rav Kook's poetic perspective on things is captured in Oros, and on on the page 118, he says the following is a translation of Bezalel Naor. He says, all the logic of our spirit and standing of our soul are founded on the light streaming from days of old and former days, and the life of our prayer, which revives our soul downtrodden by the waves of exile. They are all nourished by the sap of the life that remains ours forever until the day shall come when Israel will be uplifted and return to its tent as in the beginning. We stand full of pride and brokenness, full of joy and bitterness, full of sorrow and comfort and hope, towards the great vision that opens to us as a living treasury, from which we take the life of the divine service, life of prayer. From the greatness of our glorious past, which is the source of our lovely future, treasures of the life of the Holy of Holies for the nation and its children, for all mankind and for all creation. So what he's trying to do is saying is that here we are, we're standing in whatever diaspora community it is that we've been standing in for the last almost 2,000 years, and we're looking back at a memory of the distant past, hoping for something of the close future, merging our experiences of brokenness with the hope of the future is what we're doing when we're saying the Korbanos. Just think about the magic of all of that coming together in the way that he would say his Korbanos. Very, very beautiful perspective of what is being said here. Rabbi Sachs, actually, in his introduction to the Koren Sachs Siddur, makes the observation, which is a very important observation, is that because the Korbanos were so inner focused, they were so about the feelings and the thought process that were going on, which is why the prophets screamed at the nation of Israel when they were simply bringing superficial Korbanos without any of the thought process, contrition, or self-work going through it. That's why the prophets were shouting at Israel, right? All it was an external show. So he says that therefore, when the external show disappeared and we no longer have access to it, what is all that remains is the inner process, and that's what we're doing. Okay, so that's Rabbi Sachs's point. Is that how did tefillah become an outgrowth of the Korbanos? Because the Korbanos were meant to be a process inwardly and outwardly, and the outward now facet was removed. All that's left is the inner facet of this process. That's what we're trying to do, and that's all we can hold on to in the hope of the future, as Rav Kook is talking about over here in this. Now, in terms of, so the Aruch HaShulchan addresses the why, the night, and the day, as we talked about, but let's just focus on each of these different aspects. So the kiyor, the wash basin. So just a quick vignette on each of these. The wash basin happens to be very fascinating because it is, in and of itself isn't necessarily an avodah, right? Washing hands is not a service, but is a prerequisite to a service. What is interesting about it is that even the command for the wash basin does not appear in the regular parashiyos describing the making of the Mishkan. So in Parashas Truma and Tetzaveh is where we have the creation of the Klei HaMikdash, or the Klei HaMishkan, and then where does the Kiyor appear? Parashas Kisiso. Its making appears in Vayakel, but its commandment actually is outside. It is put into the same section as the creation of the Ketores and the Shemen HaMishcha at the beginning of Parashas Kisiso, almost as if it is part, so to speak, a necessary ingredient to the service, but not the actual service itself. That's the way it seems that the Torah is framing it. Here's something interesting to think about. Do you notice that all the other kelim in the Beis HaMikdash had some way of carrying them? Why? Because it was a Mishkan, it wasn't a Mikdash. They were going, they were moving. And therefore, all the other kelim had rings and poles in order to be able to carry it, perhaps with the exception of the menorah. So the question that's asked is, so what about the Kiyor? How did it move exactly? Now, in the Beis HaMikdash, that wasn't a question, because in the Beis HaMikdash, how many wash basins were there?
Which way is back
There were 11. In the Beis HaMikdash of Shlomo HaMelech, there were 11. There was the original, and there was another 10. Okay, so just to appreciate, it was a very complex setup, and all of them had wheels. Okay, in the Beis HaMikdash. But how did the Kiyor at the time of the Mishkan move? Rav Sorotzkin has a very beautiful observation. He quotes the Tosefta, and he describes that when the Bnei Yisrael would encamp in the desert, what would happen is that they would have to wait to see if there was going to be water, right? No, not Kiyor water, but drinking water. And what were they dependent on? The Be'er Shel Miriam, the well of Miriam, which would move with them, Can you imagine that? I'm saying like wherever you would go, you could just sort of dip a bucket in and there would be water. So the Be'er Shel Miriam would come with them. And the Tosefta says that it would depend on the spiritual temperature of Israel as to how frequent or how accessible the water source would be. So if Israel were not at their best, it would take a few hours for them to be able to locate, to be able to access the water. And if everything was just fine, then the well would be accessible right away. And therefore, it would actually lead to the point that it would say that a number of people go forward, and including the women who go forward, to daven that the well be accessible every time they came to a new encampment. And that's why in Parshas Chukas, when we describe the song of the well of Miriam, it is Ali Be'er Enu La, answering, what's La? Her, which means that Miriam was not just the one who's in Zechus it came about, it was in fact that she prayed every time they stopped and camped, and the woman would join her to pray that the well would produce the water. Now what is interesting about this is the woman seeing Miriam's critical part in the leadership of the nourishing of Israel through the water, said, well, you know what we should do? We should continue that by providing another source of water, which is, they were the ones who contributed the bronze to make the kior, which would be drawn from the well. Rav Sorotskin makes the argument that where would the well go at the end of the day when they were traveling? Where would the kior go? Into the well. You can't. There's a concern halachically of something which is called lina, which means to say that if this happened in the Beis Hamikdash as well, they would lower the wash basin down into the ground. There was a winching. Right, they would winch it down into the kior, so there would not be a problem of lina, of water which was left overnight, and it was then winched up the next morning. The Mishnah and Tommy talk about the noise as they would winch up the kior every morning. And now, when it came to in the Mishkan, the same thing would happen. Where would the kior live, and why did it not have rings to carry it? Was because it lived in the Be'er Shel Miriam. In whose zechus did it appear every time they encamped? Miriam and her cohort of women who would daven for the return of water, both for drinking and for the service. Just understanding the background of the appreciation when we say this. A very, very powerful perspective. Sorotskin talks about this at great length. Let's move on to the Trumas Hadeshin for a second. I mentioned this in Shalom, I know you quoted this yesterday, at the beginning of Parshas Tzav, we talk about the Trumas Hadeshin, and if you read in the Siddur, the section that we quote, which is the beginning of Parshas Tzav, which is why it's Tzav Yisaronis Banov Leimor, it's actually talking about the Korban Olah, the burnt offering. But in achieving the Korban Olah, the first thing that was done is Yama Olah Mokdal Mizbeach Kol Halayla Ad Haboker. It was burnt all night. Ve'esh Mizbeach to Kadboy. Then what's the first thing the Kohen does? He gets into his clothing. You take a shovel full of, a pan full of ashes, and you place it next to the Mizbeach. That's the first thing that would happen in the morning. So Rav Hirsch makes the most beautiful observation about this. If you think about it, what's the first thing the day starts with is this Trumas Hadeshin. Rav Hirsch says the following, the Hoitzas Hadeshin, in the top of page 6, the clearing of the hearth from all the remains of the preceding day to make it ready for the service of the new day, skipping the parentheses, if it has, is the most probably also an avodah, a procedure of the service of the offerings. Meaning to say, this actually could be constituted an avodah, because the translator adds in that this could be because you see that the Kohen has to wear mechin sevad, he has to wear the priestly garments. If Trumas Hadeshin is to introduce the service of the young new day with reference back to which has been accomplished on the previous day, Hoitzah would, on the other hand, contrastingly express the thought that nevertheless, every fresh day brings the whole Jewish mission to be accomplished afresh. On the other hand, contrastingly express the thought that nevertheless, every fresh day brings the whole Jewish mission to the accomplishment afresh. Fresh, as if nothing had yet been accomplished, does the beginning of every new day call us to go out on our mission with full new devotion and sacrifice, and nothing that has already been done may lessen the energy with which we go to do our duty. The thought of that which has been accomplished can be the death of that which still has to be accomplished. Woe unto him who, with smug self-complacency, thinks he can rest on his laurels of what he has already achieved, but who does not meet the task of every fresh day with full, fresh devotion as if it were the first day of his life. So, in a certain sense, what he's saying is, don't think that everything I did, all the t-shirts I got and all the selfies I took, or what allows me to be who I am, that's nothing. What about today? But on the other hand, that means to say you avoid Siyas Hadesh, and every trace of yesterday's sacrifice is to be removed from the hearth of the altar, so the service of the new day can be started on completely fresh grounds. Okay, so the first thing we do is we need to clean, so to speak, the baggage of yesterday. We all know this. We have unbelievable achievements, and we think that, okay, that's it. We're done. We're not done. We start afresh. We have to clean the surface for now today's sacrifices. But Rav Hirsch actually continues, and the next paragraph, which I did not put in here, says, but then remember that the beginning of each day starts with remembering yesterday. We can't build on yesterday, but we start with yesterday. And he says this is actually the story of Jewish destiny. Is any avodah of today is the continuation of yesterday. Not built on, not the accolades that I can be complacent, but I have to be able to. He says, the last Jewish child in history will be told the same story from their grandparents and great-grandparents of the original, and that's the Trumas Hadeshin. So Trumas Hadeshin is the merging of the yesterday to the today, the continuation of Jewish history. You know that in the Sefer Torah, there's a halacha that it should be, it's a hiddur, but the Sefer Torah should have Vavei HaAmudim, where every column starts with a Vav, which is an and, which essentially means it's all one long story. And that's what Jewish history is, one long story connected day to day by the Trumas Hadeshin, by taking out the ashes of yesterday's sacrifice for today's sacrifice as well. That's what he suggests as well. And then we move into the Korban Tamid. What is the Korban Tamid all about? So Rav Hirsch, in his commentary on the Siddur, this is not on the Chumash, but he says the following: this chapter contains the order of the Tamid, the daily offerings. Through them, morning and night, Israel comes as a keves, as a lamb before God, the shepherd of its existence, both as a group of individuals and as a nation. Through the act of sacrifice, Israel expresses its dedication, its personality, represented in the blood. To the quest of the lofty pinnacle, its destiny, that's the sprinkling on the Mizbeach. And by inference, the consecration of all its organs of perception, willpower, and achievement, those are the limbs of the Korban, as nourishment for the purifying, illuminating, and the life-giving fire of the divine Lord to find favor in his eyes. So what he is essentially saying is that every day we rededicate ourselves to Hashem. The Korban Olah, or the Korban Tamid, is a burnt offering which is brought on behalf of the community, not any individual. The first thing we start, all the Nadavas and all the Nadarim can be brought afterwards. The first thing that's brought is Israel. Let's rededicate, let's realign our wheels. What are we doing over here? Our dedication of everything, our aspirations, our willpower, our wherewithal to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He represented all these different places. Now moving on just over here to as we move towards the end, we do add these parakim of Eizehu Makaman and the Rabbi Yishmael Omer. What are they all about? So the Torah actually talks about this. It is worthwhile noting that the section in the Shulchan Aruch which talks about Korbanos is found in Orach Chaim Siman Aleph. The section which talks about Eizehu Makaman, which is this whole chapter, the fifth parak of Meseches Zvachim in Mishnayos, and Rabbi Yishmael Omer, is found later on in Orach Chaim Siman Nun. Okay, in a completely different section. So although we say it as one, it's actually not, so to speak, coming from the same source, in Halacha at least. And the Torah in Siman Nun, in the 50th chapter of Halacha, says, in source 13, V'kavu l'shanos mishnas Eizehu Makaman u'brais Rabbi Yishmael Omer b'yud gimel miros achar pashas hatamid, after we said the Korbanos in the morning, mishum ha da'amar Rav Safra, because of a statement made in the name of Rav Safra. What was Rav Safra's practice? It's something which we try to aspire to every day. Le'olam yishalesh adam shenosav shlish b'mikra, shlish b'mishnah, shlish b'talmud. If a person wants to do the right balance of learning, it should be a third, a third, a third. What does that mean? A third of Psukim, a third of Mishnah, and a third of Talmud. Uparich, umi yada kama chaye. So the Gemara says, that doesn't make sense. How do you know how long you're going to live? What was the understanding of the Gemara?
It's a lifespan.
It's a lifespan, right? So God willing, what we do is 40 years of Tanakh, 40 years of Mishnah, and 40 years of Gemara. So the Gemara says, but you don't know. You weren't given the terms of the lease. Right, so if that's the case, how do you know if you're going to spend the first 40 on Tanakh? So the Gemara says, Umeshani loy nitzracha ela leyoymei. This is a daily program that's being talked about, not a life program. Shetzarech b'chol yom lilmoid mishloshtan. You're supposed to learn all three of them on a daily basis. Therefore, the Gemara says, and he's quoting the Gemara, Umidra shel b'rais Rabbi Yishmael havi b'makom Talmud Talmud. It's the place of the Talmud, which means that essentially what are we doing here? Not only are we commemorating the Korbanos, but it is our opportunity incorporated into our davening is our learning schedule. Remember that the people over there, they did not have the wherewithal to have an all Torah app to while they were busy commuting to work in those days. right? When they left shul, that was it, right? We are so fortunate today how much Torah access we have. But institutionalized in our tefillah is psukim, that's mikra, the Mishnah of Ezehu Mekomon, and Rabbi Shmuel Omer, which is a brisa, which is still Tanaitic, but it's considered like Talmud. It's a commentary on the Mishnah itself. So that's incorporated into here. Now it happens to be that doesn't answer why specifically these, but it does talk about why these different parts of the davening. So why specifically Ezehu Mekomon? Why was this chapter chosen out of all of them? A few answers. One, the Torah goes on to say, Umishnas Ezehu Mekomon, source 14. Kavua achar parshas Tamim mishum tichsiv v'chol makom muktar mugash lishmi. It's a pasuk which says that in every place there's this, so to speak, the ashes are brought in my name. V'chi b'chol makom muktar mugash. You can't bring incense everywhere. Doesn't work in Vienna, right? Elu talmidei chachamim she'oskim b'Torah b'chol makom mali alenechem ki'ilu b'akrivim u'magishin lishmi. It means when sages are learning about this, as if wherever the kodshim is being learnt, that's where, so to speak, the incense is going up to Hashem symbolically as well. So Ezehu Mekomon, in a certain sense, is an expression of that. But it's not just that. The Beis Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, on his commentary on the Torah, which is the precursor to Shulchan Aruch, says, it's also V'tinu Kosav Ra'ah, he quotes the Ra'ah, shetiknu lashanos perek Ezehu Mekomon lefi she'ein b'ochol oisa perek machlokes. One of the only chapters in all of Shas Mishnayos that there's no dispute between the sages in Parshas, the 5th perek of Zvachim. Right? V'hi Mishnah Brura l'Moshe Misinai, which therefore indicates that it is a Mishnah Brura. What does that mean? That means that it was, if there's no argument, then it clearly means that it was all a Masorah of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of the type that was transmitted to Sinai. He's making a very fascinating observation. There are 3, perhaps 5 different subsections of oral Torah. The first and the most important part of the oral Torah is that which was given at Sinai. So we sometimes mistakenly think that the Torah Shebechsav was given at Sinai and the rabbis made up the rest. That's not true. The Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, was also given at Sinai in order to interpret it. So examples being, the Torah tells us, what pray tell is a pray tzadar, beautiful fruit. We can find all kinds of beautiful fruit. I like mangoes, you like bananas. So why do we take the citron? The answer is because Moshe was received from God that this means citron. And that's why there's no dispute. Nobody in the world, no matter which tradition, is taking a mango, because that was a tradition from Sinai. The fact that there's no dispute in this perek, says the Ra'ah, is an indication that everything in this perek is a matter of the first section of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is beyond dispute as well. It also may relate to another element just on a practical level. This is what's called halacha psuka. Halacha psuka means when it's a very clear halacha. Perhaps in the morning we don't want to get into something which is more complicated. Once you're a dispute, whenever you're a dispute, it means that the issue is complex, right? Because whenever you have a dispute, people are focusing on different elements of that issue, right? So we don't want to get involved in that because that's going to be very distracting, because suddenly we'll be like, wait a second, that's incredible. But what are they focusing on? What's the Nukuras HaMachlokas over here? Wait a second, I remember Gemara which talks about, no. Right now, we're just trying to get the overview. So that's why it's also mentioned as well, in a practical sense, as Allah Psuka as well. It is interesting, there's a beautiful commentary made by Rabbi Avram Wolfish, Dr. Wolfish, which is quoted in the most recently released RCA Siddur called Siddur Avodas Lev. It's the black new Siddur, was released 4 years ago, and he makes a very interesting observation over here. Let's see just over here where to start. He points out that if you read through the Mishnahs, which is worthwhile learning through them carefully and understanding what we're saying in Ezehu Mekomon, not just davening them, but really going through them, he points out that if you go through all these Mishnahs, there is so to speak, a broadening of the area in which the Korbanos can be brought. So in the beginning towards the end. So let's start over here on page 7. Just there's actually 4 quadrants, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm in the 4th quadrant, bottom right of this in English. He says the following: the last one in the line is of the blood of the most of these sacrifices applied like that of the sacrifices in Mishnahs 4 to 5 on the 2 corners of the altar, but the blood of the least holy of these offerings, the firstborn, the tithe of animals, the Pesach offering, which is at the end of the perek, is applied in one location only, a part of the altar wall above its base. By ranking the sacrifices in order of sanctity in accordance to the location, the Mishnah expresses the main function of animal sacrifices to draw man nearer to the presence of God. Which means to say that being as the Holy of Holies is more, so to speak, inward, and the less holy is more outward, there's an indication of hierarchy of where holiness is to be found, which is an indication to us that we need to aspire to get closer to it. it is worthwhile noting, just as an interesting observation, that the Mishnah Berurah, when commenting on this in Siman Nun and Memches, in Halacha says, this is not davening, this is learning. And therefore, a few applications. One is, the Shla HaKadosh would say that one should learn it, one should read it in a nigun of learning, as opposed to a nigun of davening. Right? There are different nuschas when davening and learning. But more than that, he says, unlike davening, which does have an impact when a person is doing it even without perception and understanding, these are less effective, because this is not about davening. This is about learning. If a person's learning, you need to learn it. That doesn't mean to say we need to know it, but we need to be trying to learn it. So it is less effective than just, so to speak, davening through the Pesukei de Zimra without understanding. That has an impact. This has much less of an impact unless we're actually doing it. So it is worthwhile, and perhaps this is a worthwhile goal. Let's say a person tries to come to shul early to get to do the Korbanos properly, and there's not enough time. What about taking one line, one Mishnah a day, and read it with a commentary? And build up over time, so that by the time one has spent 2 months on this, one actually understands what Ezer Mokaman is, and one has a picture of the map of where the different parts of the Mizbech and the different parts of the Beis HaMikdash, where we're learning about this, in order to be able to fully understand this. I try to do this by Memar Alikim on Friday night as well. Again, another example of something which is superhumanly said at the speed it said. Never mind the understanding, but if one takes a line by line and tries to appreciate it, one gets to the ultimate understanding, because it's learning, not davening as well. Finally, what about Rabbi Shmuel Omer? What is this all about? The Torah again comments in source 17. Katalmud, it's like Talmud. V'oid shehit chilas Torahs kohanim. Do you know where this appears in the actual, as a brisa, as a Tanaitic teaching? It's the beginning of Torahs kohanim. What's Torahs kohanim? The Medrash Halacha on Vayikra, which means it's thematically the same. We've just learned about the Korbanos. We just learned about, that's the Psukim. Now we talked about where the Korbanos are done. That's Ezer Mokaman. And then what's the Shmuel Omer? That's the rules of expression of this, which is found at the beginning of Torah's Kohanim. Do you know something interesting? The Malbim decided to change his lifestyle. The Malbim, Rav Meir Leibush, was a commenter, a Torah giant, started writing a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and then he noticed that there was terrible things going on around him, including the Reform movement. He was persecuted himself because of comments that he made to defend tradition, and he said, there's something wrong that's going on in the world, I need to change things. And therefore he shifted focus, and he decided that he was going to write on Tanakh to show that those who are forming in the mid-1800s and saying that all this Torah Shabbal Peh, all this oral Torah is hogwash, he says, well, I'm going to explain to you that if you had any intellectual integrity, you would arrive at the Torah Shabbal Peh if you read the Torah Shabbat properly. And what was the first thing he commented on? First thing he commented was not on the Mechilta. First comment was he wrote a book called Ayeles HaShachar on Vayikra. His magnum opus is on Sefer Vayikra, on the beginning of this, because Vayikra is the place where you need Chazal to understand what is said in the Psukim. Rabbi Shmuel Omer is giving us the tools. Rabbi Shmuel Omer is the 13 tools necessary of expanding the logic of understanding what a pasuk means, to understand what the Torah Shabbal Peh. Kal v'chomer is one of them, but there are other ones. Binyan Echa, Kasav Echad. In fact, Rav Kook actually says on this, that's the way of Hashem expressing himself as well. It's also how Hashem's logic expresses itself in the world in general, but that's more esoteric. But essentially, this is the idea of understanding what Hashem wants. This is important to contrast to Ezer Mokaman. If Ezehu Mukaman is the clear tradition from Sinai without Machlokes, this is the opposite. This is why it's important to understand it. There are two other sections of Torah Shabbal Peh. The first is what was received at Sinai. As an example, the Esrog, the fact that tefillin are black and square. Right? Those are all things which nobody disputes because they came from Sinai. They were the oral Torah. But there are other things which were not given at Sinai. Rather, God says, listen to the sages, and I'm going to give the sages certain tools in order for them to be able to expand so to speak, this system. And those tools were what we read, Rabbi Shmuel Omer. In other words, the sages are given the license to use this tool called Kal v'chomer, to have a logical inference, a build-up in logic, to be able to say, this is the concept, and if the law applies in this particular subject in X way, something which is more chamor, more weighty than it, should certainly also have that same concept. And the Torah wanted us to arrive at that. But because this is dependent on the logic of human beings, guess what? There's going to be machlokes, because some will say it should apply, and some will say it shouldn't apply. Where do you see machlokes? Only in this area of halacha, which is the Rabbi Shmuel area, not in the Ezer Mokaman area of halacha, which is halacha psuka, which is directly from Sinai. What's the third area of Torah Shabbal Peh, just as an interesting aside? Gzeira and Takonos. Chanukah, Purim, muktzah, all those things. Those are extra. Those are boundaries around the mitzvahs. They are not derivations like Rabbi Shmuel Omer. They are not traditions like Ezer Mukaman, but they are now, we'll call it new paraphernalia, new systems created in order to be able to protect us. So to be able to appreciate the differences. There's also somewhat of a machlokes somewhere there, but in some of those instances, depending on how it works. Yes.
A quick point to accentuate the communal nature of the Talmud, which you last know from Hirsch. It comes from the Machzor HaShekel, which Be'echad Ba'at Mashmiim HaShkolim, and it's ready now. Chodesh Nisan, we all have an equal share in it.
Beautiful.
It's the Talmud in all the Korbanos.
Beautiful. So we all part of that movement.
As well. Perhaps that's reinforcing.
Very true. Very true. All comes together. Last point, and then we'll close today because we're running out of time. And that is that the Baruch She'amar Baruch Halevi Epstein in his commentary on the Siddur makes the following observation: that if you notice about all these things, these are all klalim, not pratim. All these three sections, whether it be the Korbanos, whether it be the Mishnayos talking about where the Korbanos are brought, or whether it be Rabbi Shmuel Omer, are generalities. They are the forest. They are not the trees. Which means to say that he believes that the methodology in learning Torah, and again this is his observation, is that in order to appreciate Torah, to appreciate our system, if this is our format of our institutionalized daily learning, in this section of our davening, well, it's important to start with the rules and then apply them to the specific cases, the granular expressions, which is why Rabbi Shmuel Omer is quoted, because if you understand Rabbi Shmuel Omer, then you can understand every other Gemara you learn, because that's what they're doing there. If you understand the Ezer Mukaman, then you can understand all the precise details about the Korbanos because you know where it is. And in fact, he says that's why we should, technically speaking, be doing the Korban. Chatas, Ola, Mincha, all those klalim, which is mentioned in one of the Pesukim, which is we don't have in the Siddur today, but in order to be able to get to appreciate the generalities. Be'ezrat Hashem, we should have the blessing that if we dedicate a little bit extra time to this, because this really is the most overlooked part of davening, if we dedicate a little more time to whether it be coming earlier or staying later or spending a little more time on this, God willing, we should be able to see this in real life and be so much more appreciative when we see the Korbanos because it was that we took the time to spend time getting there. Have a wonderful and meaningful day, Be'ezrat Hashem, and looking forward to seeing you next week.